So here we are back in our Chapter 3 Excel. We're back in the growth value worksheet. So first of all, we're going to go through and kind of learn how to do the formulas for all these things that we just talked about in Objective 3.3. So first I want to go to my Data tab. And notice over here, I'm going to go to a data analysis. Now, hopefully by now you've got that installed. Remember that if you don't, you want to make sure that you install that to, you do the add-in for that. So I'm going to click Data Analysis, and I want the descriptive statistics, and I'll click OK. So my input range is first going to be, I'm going to pick B1 through B11. So that gives me all the data for the growth fund as well as the label. Now, since I chose the label, I want to make sure that I check this box that says labels in first row. Now, I don't want to put the output in a new worksheet. I want it to put it right here in this worksheet. So I'm just going to choose, let's put it in E1 right here. And then I want the summary statistics. And so I'll click OK. And here's my data. Now notice since I included the header, included the label, it puts growth fund right here. Now let's do it again, only this time we're going to do it for the value fund. So I'm going to come up here and change my input range. I'm going to delete this. I want to change the C1 to C11. Still want labels in first row. Now I don't want my output in E1. Let's put that in H1. And I still have got summary statistics selected. So I'm going to click OK. So now I've got my value fund as well as my mean fund, my growth fund up. Now we've looked at these in an earlier video. It gives us a lot of data. We can see the mean, we can see the median, the mode, but notice it gives us some data that we've just now learned about. We get the standard deviation, we get the sample variance. We also get the range, including the minimum and the maximum. We'll come back later and talk about kurtosis and skewness, boy, that's a mouthful, a little bit later. So before we get into comparing this data, let's look at the other formulas we can use. We notice, first of all, that this does not give us the mean absolute value deviation. That's not one of the formulas that they give us, but we can calculate that. That formula is built into Excel. We just have to calculate it separately. So I'm going to come over here and I want to first calculate the mean absolute value deviation. Now you can find these formulas on page 68 of your textbook. You'll also find them on the slides at the end of chapter 3.3 video and at chapter 3.1 video. So the formula for the mean absolute value deviation, you can do this a couple of ways. If you know the formula, you can just type it in with an equal sign. Or we can go over here to formulas, more functions, and statistical. So the mean absolute value deviation is called in Excel this AVDEV. Okay, so AVDEV opens up, so it's going to ask me what is my number. My number in this case, this is my array, if you're looking at the formula, is B2 through B11, and I'll just click OK. So the mean absolute value deviation for the growth fund is 13.56, and we calculated that in the other video that we did. And now, because the data, the value fund is right next to it, and I did not use absolute cell references, I can simply put my cursor on this lower right hand corner, pardon me. Notice it's turned into kind of a black plus sign. And I can drag over here, and now it automatically changes the formula. We can see it up here to be C2 through C11. So we've calculated the mean absolute value deviation for the value fund as well. So there's a couple of other formulas that if I want to calculate. Now if I want to calculate the range, and maybe I don't want all of the descriptive statistics, I just want to calculate the range. Excel doesn't actually have a formula for the range itself, but we can put our equal sign in. We can calculate the max out of our data here, close parentheses, minus the min out of our data here. And I'm going to press the inner sign or the check mark up here, and we get the range of 74.61, which is exactly what our descriptive statistics tell us over here. And again, I'm just going to drag this over to the value fund. Using those formulas that we were provided in the textbook, we can also calculate the sample variance and the sample standard deviation. Now, we can't calculate the population variance and the population standard deviation today because we don't have population data, but we can calculate the sample. So let's look at that. So this would be sample standard deviation. Let me make this row a little larger so we can see all of our labels. So that formula is equals STDev, so standard deviation, but notice when I start typing it in, Excel pops up formulas that start like that. Notice there's a .p and a .s. So the .p is for the population standard deviation, and the .s is for the sample standard deviation. I want the sample standard deviation, so I'm going to double click there and plug in my data for the growth fund. And now again, I can drag that over to the value fund. It's going to be the same thing when I calculate the sample variance. So again, the sample variance is going to be equal VAR, but notice again, it gives me a .p, so that's the population variance, or .s, which is the standard variance, and I want the standard. So again, I'm going to highlight, close my parentheses, press the check mark, and we can confirm that our calculations are correct because they match the data over here. So now let's talk a little bit about what is the better fund to invest in. Which would you rather invest in, the growth fund or the value fund? Well, in large part, that's going to be a personal preference. So people have different levels of risk. Now, first of all, there is a direct relationship between risk and reward. You're not going to make a lot of money if you don't take risk with your money. But the more risk you take, the more money you can more money you can make, but you will also lose or could lose more money. So the higher the risk, the higher the reward. It's how much risk are you comfortable? I personally am very risk averse. That's just my personal nature. I think it's a personality trait. I think it was maybe the way I was raised, the way I grew up. It's just, how we interpret our life circumstances. I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money. So we had to be very, very careful with our money. So I'm very risk averse because my fear is that I could lose it. My husband is the opposite. He is a risk taker. So for example, looking at the growth fund, if we look at the mean, this is the average return. So on average, the average return of the growth fund is 10%, whereas the average fund, the return of the value fund is 7.5%. Obviously, we'd rather have a 10% return than a 7.5% return. But this also can easily go the other way. Instead of making 10%, we could easily lose 10% in the growth fund. Instead of making 7.5%, we could lose 7.5% in the value fund. For me personally, I would think, I'd rather lose 7.5% than 10%. Whereas my husband's going to look at this and say, yeah, but I could make 10%. I'd rather make 10%. Notice, let's also look at the standard deviation of the two funds. So the standard deviation is kind of the average of how far the data points, the observations are from each other. So on the growth fund, they're more spread out. It's 20.4 versus 18 point almost 5. So there's more deviation there. You could make more money, you could lose more money. Again, the variance is also much larger under the growth fund than the value fund. So there's a lot more variance. Again, you can make more money, you can lose more. The range is larger. Your minimum is bigger under the growth fund, and meaning it's a larger negative number. Your maximum is larger under the growth fund. So I look at this, again, my personal bias is I look at this and think, I could lose 38% versus I could lose 36% over here on the value fund. Whereas my husband's going to look at this and say, yeah, but I could make 36% versus making 33%, right? So a lot of it depends on your personal preferences as to how comfortable you are with risk, how comfortable you are with, is it going to be okay if you actually lose? So I'm going to jump back to the notes then, and this brings us into point 3.4, which is looking at the Sharpe ratio. So the Sharpe ratio is attempting to measure the amount of reward that you would receive on average, taking into consideration the amount of risk also, right? So it's looking at the mean and the standard deviation to determine, is the potential reward worth the risk that you would take. So again, it's measuring that extra amount of reward per unit of risk. So the formula is X bar, which we know is mean. So it's the mean of the investment. So the mean of the growth fund or the mean of the value fund, minus the mean of a risk-free investment. Now, there's no true really risk-free investment, but typically, at least in the US, the Treasury bonds or the T-bills are considered the most risk-free investment, the safest investment you can invest in. So a lot of times we'll use what is the average return on the Treasury bill. And then we're dividing that by the standard deviation of the investment. So the standard deviation of the growth fund or the standard deviation of the value fund. So we're going to jump back to Excel in a minute and calculate it, but let's go ahead and calculate it here. We're assuming that the rate of the risk-free return is 2%. That's given to us. So for the growth fund, we're going to take our mean of 10.09 minus 2 and divide it by our standard deviation of 20.45. So that gives me a 0.4. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, if we compare that with the calculation of the value ratio, that gives me a Sharpe ratio of 0.3. So since 0.4 is bigger than 0.3, this is telling me if risk was equal between the two, if we consider risk to be equal, the growth fund is going to give me more return. So it's attempting to make the risk equal. And so in this case, I would want to invest in the growth fund because I'm going to get more return for the same level of risk. So let's jump back to our Excel spreadsheet here. Now there is not actually a formula for the Sharpe ratio built into Excel, but we can calculate it here. So we know the formula. I'm going to start off with my equal sign. Now remember that numerator, we've got to follow our order of operations. So I want to open parentheses. I want to take the mean of the growth fund minus that 2%, the risk-free return, close parentheses to close that numerator, divided by the standard deviation. And so I'm going to press enter, and due to rounding, it comes out to just below 0.4, right? Now I can do the same thing for the value fund. So again, I'm going to take the mean of the value fund minus that 2% risk-free return and divide it by the standard deviation. So even though the growth fund has a little bit more risk, it has enough reward that the Sharpe ratio is helping us to decide, okay, we really should invest in the growth fund. Yes, it has some more risk, but it has enough return to make that risk worth it for us.